Hey guys, Dim Gaming here, back with another survival horror piece of content for you. As the title of the video suggests, we are going to be talking about a great underrated gem of a 90s survival horror game that you probably have never heard of, and that game is Deep Fear. The reason why you probably haven't heard of Deep Fear, it came out on the Sega Saturn in the mid to late 90s, around the time that Resident Evil 1 came out on the Sega Saturn and PS1, but Deep Fear only ever came out on the Sega Saturn. It came out on the 16th of July 1998, almost 2 years after Resident Evil 1 and about 6 months after Resident Evil 2. I personally think that might have been what contributed to the fact that it did largely get overshadowed by Resident Evil, but there are a lot of qualities in Deep Fear that I like and actually prefer over the Resident Evil titles. Blasphemous, I know. It also does draw a lot of parallels to most 90s survival horror games such as Silent Hill and Resident Evil. The camera angles are fixed and the controls are tank controls. But there are a lot of things in my mind that make Deep Fear stand out. One of the things initially that makes Deep Fear stand out to me is if you take Silent Hill 1, Resident Evil 1, 2 and 3, and Parasite Eve 1 and 2, they're all set in fictitious or non-fictitious cities in the case of Parasite Eve 1 and 2. But Deep Fear is set in a totally different and more unique location. And that location is literally in an underwater facility deep in the ocean. It just makes it a more interesting setting in my opinion. Now what that does for the gameplay, it very much makes you feel like you're alone. There's not going to be that much interaction with things that aren't hostile to you, so you kind of feel a little bit more hopeless. And if you think about it, there's way less places to hide. There's literally nowhere to run because you are trapped under the ocean. One of the more interesting things about Deep Fear, which I really enjoy, is the fact that you have to worry about oxygen, and there are also, like in the background here, there are places in the facility and other areas that are either flooded or have poison gas in, so you have to use a rebreather. So not only do you have a HP bar, you also have an air bar as well. If that runs out, you die, you suffocate or you drown. It's a really cool feature. It basically just means you can't dawdle and things like that. It's very interesting and a cool mechanic. And as you can see, the character's movement speed is very much slowed down, so enemies can hit you a lot easier, so you have to be careful. One thing I forgot to mention, which is actually quite relevant to the game, because the game has different types of things such as flooded rooms, poison rooms and things like that, the oxygen can also run out in the facility. When it does, you pull out your rebreather. However, you can get air grenades which will replenish the air. As you see in the top right hand corner of the footage in the background, the entire video, that's your oxygen level. But you can also go to terminals and replenish the oxygen. It's pretty good and it just makes for interesting gameplay because you can just run around with your rebreather on, but your rebreather can also run out of air and then you just die, so you have to be very careful. That adds an iota of atmosphere to the game. Speaking of enemies as well, it's kind of classic survival horror 90s enemies. You have the strong enemies that take a lot of bullets but they're quite slow, but when they hit you they do a lot of damage. You have the kind of standard grunt enemies or the T-virus zombies style enemies. They are kind of run-of-the-mill enemies, but there's a lot more of them. You have like dog style enemies and things like that. But this game does have a really cool diverse selection of enemies. They are really cool looking as well because it's a different kind of virus. It's more of a parasite that mutates. It's really interesting and it mutates its hosts. So the enemies are quite cool. As you can see, this one in the background looks awesome. It's a really cool enemy. I feel like the gunplay in this for a 90s survival horror game is really good. So you have kind of two states. You have your normal character state where you can run around and interact with things, and then you actually pull your weapon out and then you can run around and shoot, which is quite interesting. As you can see the character here, I'm running around and shooting. It's a lot more intuitive in my opinion, and you also have a dodge. You can jump backwards, so if an enemy goes to swing at you, you can literally jump backwards and you can keep jumping backwards. It's really cool. It's a lot more fluid of a system in my opinion than the earlier Resident Evil games, where you have to aim and stop, whereas this you can aim and run and shoot at the same time. It makes for more interesting combat in my opinion. As you can see in this footage here, I actually threw a hand grenade. You can have an item you can set, so you can set a healing item or a grenade or something like that to actually be used, which is really interesting. Again, that's something that the early Resident Evil games and Silent Hill, for example, you weren't able to do. It's really cool, and it makes the gameplay, again, more intuitive. And interestingly enough, it segues into the weapon systems and how many weapons you get. You can carry one pistol, which you always have on you when you get it. Later on you can get a second one, and then you have one secondary weapon. You can either have one of the submachine guns, rifle, or shotguns in the game, but you can only carry one of them. So for example, if you want to run the shotgun, you can only run the shotgun and the pistol. It's not like you carry all of them with you. And what's cool as well, whatever weapon you have equipped, if you have any of the shotguns, it shows them physically on your back, and the machine guns and the rifle get stored on your hip. It's really cool. Just a little good attention to detail, again, which most survival horror games from that era didn't do. You also have a harpoon gun, which you can use in the flooded areas. It's really cool. It's quite slow, but it is quite powerful also. Another way Deep Fear draws parallels with Resident Evil and Silent Hill is the voice acting. It's very 90s. It's not as bad as Resident Evil 1, but it has a long way to go. But saying that, the voice acting isn't too bad. The characters are interesting as well. There's basically a bunch of different characters who all have different jobs that are in this underwater facility. You play the main character. His name is John Mayer. He's an ex-Navy SEAL with a bit of a tragic past. For example, there's a character called Danny who's kind of the mechanic character, and he has an interesting storyline that you don't find out until later. And then you have the leader of the facility, Commander Clancy, who, in my opinion, is a bit of a dick. But again, you find out kind of why he's a bit of a dick. The story basically progresses and all of the characters kind of interlock in their destinies and their stories. It's a really interesting and kind of well thought out story too. Basically, if you love 90s survival horror and you're wanting to find something different that doesn't feel different control and gameplay wise, Deep Fear is a surefire hit. It has all those 90s nuances that made that the best generation of survival horror in my opinion. There's just a lot of things that make Deep Fear a really fun game. However, one of the annoying things is there's no New Game Plus and there's nothing after. Once you complete the game, that's it. You just have to go back and complete it again from scratch. So that's it from Deep Fear. If I had to give it a rating out of 10, it would literally be a 9 out of 10 for me. I just really wanted something new from old survival horror, if that makes any sense. I've been playing Resident Evil and Silent Hill and, you know, things like Parasite Eve for 20-25 years at this point. This just felt like a breath of fresh air for me. Go and check it out. It is a little bit harder to get hold of. The UK copies of the game, you have to have a Sega Saturn, and you also have to have a copy of the game. The UK version is anywhere between 300 to 400 quid. You can pick up a Japanese or North American version because it didn't really get a widespread Europe release. There are other ways to do it. I'm obviously not going to tell you on here, but if you can, go check it out. This is Simmers Dim Gaming. Let me know if you've played Deep Fear and what you think of it. I love it, and I'll see you in the next one.